back to phase 2 of looking at these terrain modules. So this is what I was working on last week. And these are corner sections for the 3-foot square boards that I'm going to be using for Woods in the Woods, which in that weird sort of quirk of recording stuff and uploading it before its scheduled date for release was last weekend. So if you got to see these finished in person, and I hope that they were finished by then, I hope you liked them, and if you didn't, you may have seen them in the photographs since. I hope they turned out all right. At this stage, they're looking pretty good. It's just whether I have enough time to work on them fully and get them to the level that I want. And we mentioned a little bit last week when I was carving these about the purposes for them. So I was thinking about this one. I wanted to be able to place models moving up the hill, so this is why this one has got these kind of tiers filed into the surface. This one is quite level on the top here, you can place models on. This one has some levels here that you can place models on, but then cliff surfaces that are harder to access, and this one is fairly impenetrable. So I've been thinking about the levels while carving these, making sure that they're not sloping so much that models fall over when you put them on them, making sure that the spaces are big enough for bases to move around them. And now we're going to look at putting a covering over here to make them robust enough to use on the tabletop. So for vertical surfaces where you're not placing models, you're going to try and protect them from bumps and scratches and maybe introduce a little bit of texture along the way, but we're generally not too worried unless they're going to be carried around a lot or put in sort of boxes in storage and shoved under your bed or something like that. That's when they're going to take their damage. But for the rest of the tabletop, where you're placing models, where you're placing other scenery, where you might be rolling dice, you need to really protect those areas from denting, scratching, knocking your surface off, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, some of this around the bottom of here, I'm going to be applying grass mat, and I'm thinking that will be my next video. If I have time to shoot, my next video will be putting the grass mat on here, because there is a bit of a technique to it, but it's really effective, and it's something that I'd like to show off if I have time to record the video while I'm doing it. But what we're going to be looking at the moment is protecting these surfaces that are going to be sort of bare rock, or they're going to have flock or static grass and things put on over the top rather than the grass mat, the mat being fairly durable by itself. And what I'm going to use is dilute PVA. Now, some people swear by using a substance called Mod Podge, which is a kind of hard-wearing PVA substance that's designed for doing decoupage and scrapbooking and that kind of thing. Fine, perfect. If you want to use Mod Podge, absolutely use Mod Podge. I find Mod Podge quite expensive for doing this with. I use it quite a lot for doing water surfaces, textures of waves and things. It works really nicely for that because it's really high sheen and really transparent, so you get a really nice sort of slightly foamy, ripply effect on the surface. But for something that I'm going to paint and I'm going to cover up, I find Mod Podge quite an expensive way of doing it. So this is just regular PVA glue, diluted about 50-50 mix. And this is all that I'm going to use for doing the surfaces that aren't going to be touched by models. That's all I'm going to put on there. But I am going to put in some paint, because there are several ways of painting stuff, and quite often I like to spray things. Don't spray foam directly. If you spray foam directly, it will dissolve the top surface of the foam. You'll get a melty effect similar to that with heat guns. So don't do that. But once it's had a layer of glue on, then by all means go ahead and use a spray primer, spray paint on it. Airbrushing works quite nicely if you've got an airbrush and you want to airbrush some just a nice sort of thick base layer of paint on, that's fine. But the paint, I don't think by itself will provide a particularly significant protective surface, and you really do want that, otherwise you're going to be repainting it so often. I wouldn't put PVA glue into your airbrush. That's not a good idea. So what I'm doing here is I've mixed a bit of black and a bit of brown paint, and it's going a bit speckly, but that's fine because the PVA, when it's set, it will dry transparent or pretty clear in any case, so the colour won't show up. Sorry, the colour in it will show up through the glue. And the reason that I'm doing this is that it's very hard to get paint into all of the tiny little cracks and crevices here, and I want to make sure that I do that with the glue. So if I'm doing it with the glue, I might as well do it with some paint as well, and then I can brush paint over the rest to give it a more even finish. But I want to make sure that the very insides of these tiles are covered. Okay, that'll be fine. It's just a bit of black in there, but also a bit of brown. This is just cheap from the works Crawford and Black paint. This is burnt umber that I've mixed in there as well. Just because it's an art thing that if you put black on something, it kind of kills the values. So if you've got a little bit of blue or a little bit of brown in there as well, that will just help you to help it to not look dead when you put the rest of the paint back on. Because anyone who's looked at rocks will tell you that rocks aren't grey, they're not black and white. There's lots of tones of browns, of yellows, of greens, of reds in there. So when we come to paint this up, I'm going to be trying not to go with a very dull, boring grey scheme. That being said, the rocks that are already on my board are quite dull grey, so I will be trying to match in with those, but I may also go back to those and do a bit of washes and things in other colours to distress them, to make them look a bit more interesting and a bit more natural. And you might be able to see, while I'm brushing this on here with just a big brush, going quite thickly, because this is quite thin paint, it will run into all of the gaps, that where I've used the craft knife to take out some of these areas there, they're sort of moving with the brush and they're a bit flaky. That's fine, don't worry about that. So maybe some pieces have fallen off entirely, and I'm just going to brush them back into the cracks and get them to stay, because this glue mixture will hold everything nice and firmly in place once it's completely covered. Okay, so I've now stippled paint onto, or glue rather, onto all of my impenetrable sheer rock surfaces. So now I want to deal with these more slopey areas here. And what I'm going to do for that is take the same glue and paint mix that I've been using. I'm just going to add some of this ready mix filler. Now you can put neat filler on, but I prefer to be able to mix this to the consistency that I like. It's important that you mix powder to the glue water mix rather than the other way around. Otherwise you'll end up with a very gloopy mess. And just add a bit at a time and mix it in quite thoroughly so that you can see what you're actually going to be working with. And what I want here is something that's not going to clump up and stick to the brush particularly, but is going to paint on with a bit of resistance, so that I know that it's got that layer of protective filler in the mix. And partly what that's going to do is smooth these areas. I don't want to smooth them too much because I quite like the texture showing through. But these bottom areas here where I'm going to be bringing the grass mat in, I want them to be nice and smooth, so that there's plenty of room for the adhesive to stick the mat down. I think that's pretty good. And the thicker that you make this mix, the quicker it will go off. So I don't want this to go off particularly quickly. I've got a few terrain modules to do here. So I'm going to leave it fairly dilute. And I'm still going to brush this on, but this is very much sort of sitting and spreading on the surface now, rather than me having to dab it into all of the cracks and the crevices. And I am going to go over these rocks where I put the rock molds in place here. I am going to go over those because this will help to flow into the gaps in between them and join them up, and also help to bond them onto the board, and it will help to just add an extra protective surface. There is some texture in the top of these rock molds, which is obviously, you want to preserve that. So I don't want to go thick with a really sort of speckly texture onto them, but at the same time I kind of want to paint them into the hole. And I'm just going to let it flow where there's a bit of a lip where the foam joins the board. I'm just going to sort of brush up and let the filler flow into that step, because this filler will dry quite firmly. It might crack a little bit if you've got a thick area, but we're talking a few mil, sort of 2-3 mil step here, so there shouldn't be much cracking. It'll just blend that surface into the bottom of the board. Similarly, on top surfaces like this, you can apply it quite thickly, let the texture within the filler provide its own textural surface, breaking up that flat edge of the foam. And that'll dry nice and firm. And obviously, if you want, you can try different thicknesses. So you may want to preserve texture in some areas more than others. You can mix a thinner batch where you want to preserve the texture, and a thicker batch for flatter areas where you want to be adding extra texture. And you can add other powders into this as well. Sometimes adding sand in is quite good for both durability and a bit of added texture. You can get powders that are designed as fillers for resin and fiberglass work, so things like phyllite powder. That does quite a good job. And you can also use, there's a substance called jesmonite, which I've used in scenic applications, as in stage scenic applications, for creating rocks. And that's basically, it's a plaster or a gypsum based fiberglassing system, but it's really good for creating sort of natural looking rocky textures, and you could buy it in small quantities and use it for this application. That will give you a really sturdy surface. I think I've mentioned elsewhere, one of the things that I like to add into rocky slopes is cat litter. And my favourite is the Fuller's Earth, really cheap Fuller's Earth cat litter, because you sprinkle it on and it soaks up all of the glue, so you can get that to bond really, really firmly. I don't have any of that with me at the moment. What I do have is some of this, which is slightly more expensive, kind of, they call it terracotta. I'm sure it's not terracotta, but this is kind of clay based, I think, cat litter. And just scattering this in sections onto the wet filler, so that there's plenty of moisture there to soak up into the cat litter. And once that has gone off, then I'll dilute just some neat PVA and dab that onto the cat litter. If you mix a little bit of washing up liquid on and then either spray it or brush it on, the washing up liquid helps break the surface and helps it to flow and seep better into the litter, and that will hold everything nice and firmly. So I've sort of focused here around the edges of the lips, not on the tops of the lips where I want to be able to place bases, because anything that stands proud like this litter is going to be very prone to getting knocked off, but into the creases where sort of loose stones and boulders would accumulate. That's where I'm going to sprinkle the litter in, because it'll also be quite safe from being knocked off by moving models around. And where there are gaps in the foam here, so I've joined a few pieces of foam together and they haven't quite bonded, particularly on this one actually, where I've heat gummed and it's created a bit of a ravine. Probably need a couple of layers of the filler because you don't want to apply it too thickly, but this filler will cover those joins quite nicely. And if you've got big gaps, you might want to go straight in with a pre-mixed filler. I think most fillers, they say that you can get away with about 1 centimetre gap. You could go straight in with a pre-mixed filler to fill that gap, and then brush your pigmented textured filler mix over the top once it's dry. Don't want to try to work on filler once it's wet. You need to wait for it to dry. And I'm not going to put too much, so I will be wanting to carry on this sort of cat litter spill down onto the bottom area here where I'm going to have grass, but I don't want to do that yet because I need to lead the grass up. It's one of those odd things. Ideally, what I would do is put the grass mat in place and then texture the rocks sort of up to it, because the rocks are kind of coming up through the grass layer, but because I want to smooth out some of this slope for applying the grass, and because this is a messy process and I want to keep the grass pretty clean and clear in those areas, it's better to do this. I'm going to be hitting this with a big dry brush and I don't want to be getting that over the grassy corners. So I need to do all the rock work first and then put all the grass work on top. So that is going to involve a little bit of going backwards and forwards between two processes to sort of strike a balance between the two. Okay, so now that has all dried, I'm going to try and shake off any of this loose litter, anything that hasn't quite absorbed enough glue, but that's staying on pretty well. There's still quite a lot left because I had quite a liquid mix, but I'm now going to apply a very watery mix. So this is still the same pot of filler and glue mix, but with a bit more water in. So this is now probably diluted by another 50%, topping it up with just water with a little bit of fairy liquid to improve the flow. And I'm just dabbing that over mostly where the areas of loose cat litter are, and that'll add a bit of colour to them, but it'll also make them a lot stronger. They'll just all glue together and soak up all of the moisture, and they'll be fixed really firm. And you can see that some of them are picking up on the brush here, but that's fine as long as I either sort of shake them off back onto the board or I shake off the board completely. It's not a problem if they move around a little bit. And I'm going to go over the top of the rocks as well, just to add a little bit of colour. And that's pretty much it for this stage. Then it's just a case of sitting back and letting it completely dry. You can see some of these rocks in the foreground are starting to get a bit darker where they're drying out completely, where the white of the glue is leaving. So hopefully it'll all go that nice dark colour, and in the next video we'll look at dry brushing.